Thank you very much. Can I ask our presenters from this morning to join us at the panel for a brief question and answer session? So if you have any questions, if you would just use the mics in the center, please.
Bob Wirtz, NIH. I took a trip across North Dakota 2 weeks ago, and instead of seeing the scenery, I spent a lot of time on siding because the railroads were shipping oil on 100-car trains. Okay, but the point of this is that the railroads are required to take passengers, even though they make all their money on freight. From what you said, the airlines are making money on passengers and not on freight, and there's no regulation that they have to take freight. My conclusion is that the destiny of shipping animals by air is that it just won't be done, that it's more trouble for the airlines in cost than they gain, and they're in business to make money. Is that incorrect?
I'll respond to that. That's perfectly correct. There is no national policy that requires us to do that. When we deregulated, what they called the public convenience and necessity went out the window. There was a point in time that, at that point, Civil Aeronautics Board said you will do this, you will do that. If you pull out of a city, you needed to be talking to the city fathers before you pulled out and get their confirmation. And what were you going to do to backfill the loss of that carrier? Same thing with cargo. So yes, you're absolutely correct. And that's kind of the direction we're going unless we develop a national policy. And quite frankly, I was talking to somebody just in back of me here, and I said that will probably happen when pigs fly, because that's kind of where we are right now in terms of getting things through government. But yeah, very astute observation.
Steve Nemi, co-chair of the roundtable. Picking up on this theme, it's obvious that there's a divergence of interests, and I don't believe we can use the moral imperative anymore to twist arms and plead for lab animal shipment. So has any scenario planning been done to look at a variety of possible alternative universes and what the costs or the consequences would be from those alternatives? And if not, maybe this is something we should discuss when the roundtable convenes on Friday as one outcome from this workshop, and bring people from a variety of specialties outside of lab animal to help us look at various outcomes and what those might cost, what those might limit, and the consequences on research.
I'll take that. So at this point, I don't think that sort of planning is happening. I think part of what we're trying to do here is give everybody a wake-up call, because if you're not intimately involved in the process, you make a lot of assumptions. And the other thing here too is it's not only shipping animals, but it's shipping them safely and humanely. You know, there's no point in shipping animals if they're going to be stressed, if they're going to get sick, or they're going to die in transport. And while there's a reasonably good success rate, it's not perfect, but it'll get worse if we start limiting the carriers and routes and options. The worst thing that you can do is have a complex route over a long distance with many transfers. I mean, that's a recipe for failure. So anything that limits the direct shipment is going to be problematic, and the research community, you need to wake up.
I'm Susan Silk, and my job is to manage the questions from the shy people in the audience. I don't know if there are any shy people in this audience, but if there are, you can put your questions on the bulletin board parking lot outside, and I'll come forward and read them for you. And that's a job I'm going to also do for the people online. We have 2 questions that came in from online. One is directed at Bill White, and someone from one of the shipping systems companies wonders, where did you get your percentage of death rates for transportation?
Okay, so if you notice, I said commercial breeders is one of the little words in that. So the major commercial breeders in North America, many of whom have a large percentage of shipment globally and production facilities globally, went through and looked at their shipping records, and again, the caveat that it was everything was thrown in, because when you have a failure, it doesn't matter whether it was transport or whether you put the wrong number of animals in the box. So that's as close as we could get. And that covered a large number of containers, okay? I want to say it was well over 1 million containers in 1 year globally. So that's the numbers that came up.
Thank you.
Okay.
And the next question is for you, Bruce. Someone at the University of Idaho wonders, does IATA 3.9.2.5, I can see him going through his file cabinet there, require that Krelox mice or other genetically modified mice be labeled as dangerous goods, thus not allowing them to go on passenger airlines? And why don't we open that up to the whole committee? Are genetically modified organisms labeled as dangerous goods when they're transported?
I know it was addressed to you, Bruce. I sat on the dangerous, I sat on the Dangerous Goods Board for IATA also. The answer is no. GMOs are not considered dangerous goods.
Thank you.
And I might add, they should never be packed that way, because that's generally incompatible with life.
Excuse me, Steve Leary from Washington University. In the late 90s, I had the privilege of serving on a small ad hoc AVMA committee here in their GRD office. When Carl and Greg and their counterparts, some other airlines, came in and gave us an education. The purpose was to respond to some proposed new regulations from the FAA. And the FAA had assigned it to a young attorney who expected to hear nothing from the public and was stunned when hundreds of comments and responses came in that he didn't know anything what to do with. So one of the, we looked at a number of issues, but one had to do with training. Carl has touched on it. And the concern was that while at the major hubs, training was probably adequate, in the smaller, at smaller airports or in the nether regions of the country, the training was inadequate or in some areas non-existent. And so I guess my question is, and I don't know if FedEx addresses this with their service, has that changed or improved or not, because it can affect people in smaller areas, like just a question from Idaho, for example. By the way, I had occasion to contact that same FAA attorney a few years later when I think it was an IATA issue that Bill and I were working on. And the response from the civil servants was, "Oh, no, not you. I never wanted to speak with you again."
One thing regarding the training that is very troublesome for airlines is the fact that, as Carl mentioned, you're dealing with third-party providers that are most often paying minimum wage. So the turnover amongst these third-party providers is huge. So you may train them and spend a fair amount of resources to do so, only to find that they're going to take the next job down the road, and now you're doing the training all over again.
And just, Steve, just to comment on the unintended consequences of regulation. It's been a few years back, but I came down here and we sat before the FAA, actually the Department of Transportation, with regards to the transport of radioactive isotopes. This is a classic example and it has a good parallel here. And they basically said, listen, anybody that handles radioactive isotopes, and I think most everybody in the room probably is aware what that is, sterile water, basically we've been exposed to different radioactive sources. He says, everybody in the airline industry is going to have to wear a dosimeter, and you are going to have to be checked every month. And so the airlines looked at that and understand about radioactive isotopes. They have a very limited life. Some of them got a 5-hour life. Some of them have a much longer life. So speed is absolutely critical. So the airline industry, myself and the head of the Air Transport Association at the time said, hey, not a problem. You run this through, you will be out of business. Because we will not transport, and we are not going to take on all of that for somebody that may never ever touch one. So with that pushback from the industry and from the nuclear industry too, the people, the GEs of the world who produced those, they said, you better re-look at this again. And of course, that regulation went away. So it was a partnership between the parties involved, the producers of it, those of us that carry it, that went back and said, some unintended consequences, folks, you better relook at it. And we see that today in a lot of areas. But thanks for the question, Steve.
I got just one comment on that also. I think it's in this edition of the law that we, the Live Animal and Perishables Board, did put in a requirement that acceptance personnel that are dealing with live animals need to be trained on the LAR, to have a basic knowledge of the LAR and what they're accepting. So we do recognize that training is an issue, and we are trying to take steps to address that within the airline industry.
Robert Russell, laboratory animal medicine consultant. This question for Bill. I imagine most of the animals from the commercial suppliers are delivered by ground transportation. Do you have any idea what academia is doing as far as ground versus air transportation, and how are they dealing with that?
I think once you get past a very short radius, say 50 to 100 miles, where there can be a local courier used, it's almost exclusively ground to an airport, airport to a regional place near where the destination is, and another ground transportation. I think without air transportation, it is not economically feasible for most academic institutions, government institutions, to ship animals. It just will not be. You have to, there's a lot of cost. If you pull some of the folks that do ground transportation aside and look at what you have to do in terms of mileage, et cetera, it can cost, to go across country and with a reasonable number of animals, it could cost $20,000 or more, and that's assuming they can backhaul something. So, yes, unless you have continued air transportation, I don't think you're going to be moving animals from one institution to another.
I think we had one more question.
I had a question about the IATA regulations, live animals regulations. How enforceable are those? Are there government entities, agencies that recognize those regulations as essentially enforceable, just like our USDA regulations are enforceable by law? Failure to meet those IATA regulations, are there fines associated? And if you can just comment about that, and also how you interface with the government agencies that govern transport.
I'll just go first. Bruce mentioned it in his talk, and I forgot to say that those 2005, they make the IATA live animal regulations part of the legislation in the EU. However, they have fixed on the 2004 edition. So, just to complicate your lives, Bruce has got a nice current copy here, but if you were shipping to the EU, moving animals within the EU. For enforcement purposes, as an enforcer, I have to use the 2004 edition, which is silly, but that's what we're stuck with. So certainly in the EU, the IATA are part of legislation and can be used. And it's great for us as an enforcer. Does it meet the law? No. Guilty. That's it. The end. So very easy court cases for us.
And is also by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and certain APHIS uses it also in the U.S. as part of the legislation. So, and I think China has actually referenced it in some cases. In Canada also. So there are various governments around the world that do incorporate into regulation and use it for enforcement.
Just to summarize it, we do not have the IATA police. They have no authority. So by reference, these countries reference the regulations, so it would be the enforcement action of the specific countries who have adopted the regulations into their national law. It would be their responsibility for enforcement proceedings.
One more comment is there are different agencies who decide whether they're going to refer to the most current copy of the law or whether they're going to use a much older copy. Problem with using an older copy is that new information, new standards that make it safer and more effective to transport are not the guidance that is being used. So if there is one thing I would try to change, it would be to get those who are in fact using the law as part of their guidance that they do this based on the current edition of the law. And I realize that's a little problematic because you're endorsing something in perpetuity, but again, we've had various government agencies send representatives to IATA on a regular basis to participate in that and to help refine the documents. I know the Fish and Wildlife Service has participated. I know that APHIS has participated. So it's a very viable body that wants to do a good job.
Okay. With that, I think we're going to end our Q&A session, and I'd like to thank our panel members for their presentations as well as their responses. Thank you very much.